This is a presentation on Arab Spring in Sub-Saharan Africa, a close shave or a beckoning crisis. I am Ura Kwabanakofo in the research methods class. So here what I try to find out is why the Arab Spring did not spread to Sub-Saharan Africa, and I use two theories to explain my work. I use the theory of fractionalization and the theory of state disengagement, and I come up with a hypothesis that the more fractionalized a country is, the lower its chances of experiencing an uprising. And the higher the level of fractionalization, the higher the level of state disengagement, and the lower the chances of uprising. So, looking at the method in my data, I took data basically from the World Bank and Alessine's ethno-linguistic fractionalization data. And then I used the RStudio data analysis tool and the Microsoft Excel to do a comparative analysis of the factors that cause the Arab Spring in North Africa as against Sub-Saharan African countries. After this, I use the ethno-linguistic fractionalization data to do a comparative analysis of these countries and draw my conclusions from the findings that I made. So, in order to determine which countries are authoritarian in nature and those which are not, I relied heavily on Berlin's own data that she used. Basically, she picked data from the Freedom House Index, and in the Freedom House Index, there is a scale of 1 to 7, 1 being very free and 7 being the least free or not free. So, based on this data, I chose the countries in Sub-Saharan Africa that have been marked as not free at all, like the worst performing countries on the data in Sub-Saharan Africa. And I got countries like Angola, Central African Republic, Cameroon, Egypt, Ethiopia, Gabon, and Sudan. And so all the countries that you see all the countries that you see their bars moving to the extreme right are countries that have high levels of authoritarianism, if I should put it. And the countries you see with lower bars are countries that have that are basically free, according to the Freedom House Index. And so after I had chosen these countries, I chose Burkina Faso as a control country because they experienced something of that nature in 2014. And so I used Burkina Faso as my control variable. So I began to analyze these countries in terms of the factors that has already been given by Berlin. I look at the issue of GDP to determine the economic health of the various countries. And from the data, you realize that most of these Sub-Saharan African countries that are being analyzed were relatively richer than the Sub-Saharan African countries, with the exceptions of Angola and Sudan. And in the case of Angola, for instance, Angola, Gabon, and Sudan, in the case of Angola and Gabon, it can be explained. I mean, if you are using the GDP variable, I'm talking about the total income of the country, and these two countries are oil producing countries, and therefore it reflects in the type of income that they do have. But generally speaking, the northern African countries seem to be richer than the Sub-Saharan African countries. And so if the condition is that these countries will have to be poor economically, then it makes a rational sense to argue that then these selected Sub-Saharan African countries should have experienced Arab Spring than the northern African countries. The other thing I also look at is the percentage of the population that are youthful in nature. Again, you realize that the Sub-Saharan and the northern African countries do have a higher percentage of youthful population than the Sub-Saharan African countries. However, the interesting phenomenon is that most of these Sub-Saharan African countries have their youthful population either at least at 50% or above 50%, with the exception of Somalia and Angola. And so if you have a country with 50% of its population being youthful, then it could also be argued that they should have experienced the Arab Spring, because basically the argument that Berlin makes in her paper is that the more youthful a population is, the more radical they are in nature, and the more likely that they will use protest as a means of registering their grievances as compared to the other means of protests like petitioning and the rest. So Berlin also makes the argument that one of the most important factors in bringing about the Arab Spring was social mobilization through social media. That the youth in these countries relied heavily on social media like Facebook, Twitter, etc. to mobilize people onto the streets. And so from the World Bank data, I checked the rate of internet usage, because if you are going to use social media, you need internet to do that. And based on this, I was able to find that social use of social media is higher in North African countries than some Saharan African countries, and this totally makes sense. However, a similar type of uprising happened in Burkina Faso. Even though they did not have this high rate of internet usage, they were able to mobilize people onto the streets to protest against the government. So I use the score for Burkina Faso as the baseline, and if you have other African countries that are higher than this, sub-Saharan African countries that are higher than the score for Burkina Faso, then at least they should have also experienced Arab Spring. However, that was not the case. So then I come up with my explanation for the non-spread. Basically, what I find out is that I use the data of fractionalization by Alessina, and I compare these countries to see their degree of fractionalization. So fractionalization simply is a theory which simply means that the probability that any two random people selected from a country and interviewed belong to two different ethnic groupings or to speak two different languages. That is the definition of fractionalization. And so if your fractionalization is very high, then it means you have a lot of social cleavages in your country. If your fractionalization is very low, then it means you have some sort of homogeneity in the people in your country. As can be seen in the data in terms of ethnic fractionalization, you realize that fractionalization is higher in sub-Saharan African countries than North African countries. All this means is that you find a lot of groupings or ethnic groupings in sub-Saharan African countries than in North African countries. If you look at the language fractionalization too, a similar thing appears, and then in terms of religion, a similar thing also appears. So what this means is that basically if you have people from different social cleavages, then it becomes difficult that they all rally against one particular decision, because they all have different interests. In terms of this paper, what I actually argue is that Berlin in a paper states that these northern African countries, in order to determine how robust their military are, you have to find out the nature of the power structure in their countries. So if the military is formed against familial and ethnic lines, then there's a higher likelihood that the military will stand to fight the protesting citizens, because they know that if the government should fall, their lives will be at stake. However, if the military is formed along patrimonial and clientelistic lines, then it will depend on whether the military feel that the government is going to survive the uprising, and that their source of livelihood is going to be guaranteed. If it's not going to be guaranteed, they are going to desert the government in favor of the people. And what Berlin's own data shows is that most of the military regimes are formed against, in the northern Africa, were formed against familial lines. So what this shows is that the power structure in these countries are formed along ethnic and familial ties. And if you have a situation where you have a lower form of fractionalization. What that means is that you will have two major dominant groups in the country, and that creates a situation of a zero-sum game whereby if one is in power, then the other group is more likely to be suppressed and discriminated against in terms of sharing the resources of the state. So there is a lot of motivation and incentive to overthrow such a government whenever there is a possibility of protesting through an uprising. But if the society is highly fractionalized, then it means the government is going to rule through patrimonial and clientelistic systems, and that will mean that a lot of people will get to benefit, and so the incentive and motivation to go through that risk of overthrowing a government will not be as high as in a less fractionalized country, and this is what the data clearly shows. Additionally, I try to run some correlations to see whether there is a linkage between any of the variables that I'm dealing with. In this particular data, for instance, I try to find out whether there is a linkage between the population and the GDP, whether countries with a higher population tend to have a higher GDP or not. When I did run the scatter plot, I found out that it wasn't the case for all the countries. It was for some of the countries that I found here, but it's not the case for those lying way away from the line. I also try to find out which of the variables do have correlations and whether the correlations are positive or negative. So from here you realize that population and internet usage, for instance, has a positive correlation, and by population here I mean the number of people who are youthful. So if you have a useful population, it's more likely that they are going to make good use of the internet. The same can be seen for ethnic fractionalization and internet usage. This is a negative correlation, that the more ethnically fractionalized the country is, the less internet they do use. Same goes for language and religion. However, there was a positive correlation between political rights and civil liberty. So based on this, I did a regression to find out which of them do have I did a regression of all the variables against religious fractionalization, for instance, to find out which of them do have a correlation or is likely to cause that thing. And here the only one that is statistically significant is internet usage, and even with that one is to the negative. So it brings me to the end of my presentation. That makes me realize that in fact fractionalization explains why the Arab Spring did not spread to Sub-Saharan Africa. Thank you.